I've spent 27 years trying to forget what happened in the remote forests of northern Washington in the fall of 1996. The official reports called it an equipment malfunction and worker negligence. The insurance companies labeled it an act of nature. But I was there, and I know the truth about what drove us from those ancient woods in absolute terror. Our logging crew had been contracted by a major timber corporation to clear a section of old-growth forest in the Olympic Peninsula. The job promised excellent pay for 6 weeks of work, clearing roughly 400 acres of prime Douglas fir and western red cedar. Some of those trees were over 300 years old, massive giants that had been growing since before the Declaration of Independence was signed. The contract seemed straightforward enough. We were an experienced crew of 8 men, all seasoned loggers who'd worked together for years. We had modern equipment, 2 Catfeller bunchers, a John Deere skidder, and a link belt loader capable of handling the largest logs. The company provided a base camp with sleeping quarters, a mess hall, and a maintenance shed about 2 miles from the work site. What made the job unusual was its isolation. We were working in a section of national forest that required special permits, supposedly because of endangered spotted owl habitat. The nearest town was over 60 miles away, and the logging road leading to our site was little more than a dirt track that wound through increasingly dense wilderness. The foreman had worked this area before and warned us that cell phone coverage was non-existent once we got beyond the first ridge. We'd be completely cut off from the outside world except for the company's satellite phone, which was only for emergencies. For men used to calling home every evening, this added an element of isolation that made everyone slightly uneasy from the start. The drive to the work site took nearly 4 hours from the nearest highway, following logging roads that hadn't been maintained in years. Ancient stumps from logging operations decades past dotted the landscape like tombstones, gradually giving way to dense second-growth forest, and finally to the pristine old growth we'd been contracted to cut. The trees grew larger and more imposing as we climbed higher into the mountains, their canopy so thick that the forest floor remained in perpetual twilight even during midday. Our base camp was situated in a natural clearing beside a fast-running stream that provided fresh water and served as our main landmark in the featureless wilderness. The company trailers were basic but functional. Sleeping quarters for 8 men, a mess hall with propane appliances, and a well-equipped maintenance shed for servicing our equipment. A diesel generator provided power, though we were instructed to run it only when necessary to conserve fuel between supply runs. The first few days were spent establishing our operation and surveying the timber we'd been contracted to harvest. The trees were magnificent specimens, some reaching heights of over 200 feet with trunk diameters exceeding 6 feet. Douglas firs that had been seedlings when Lewis and Clark crossed the continent stood in cathedral-like groves, their trunks so straight and true they seemed to stretch directly into heaven. Mixed among the firs were western red cedars of even greater age, their massive buttressed bases and fibrous bark telling stories of centuries spent weathering Pacific storms. These were the trees that Native Americans had used for their longhouses and totem poles, cutting them selectively and with reverence. We would be harvesting them with mechanical efficiency for dimensional lumber and wood chips. Our first week proceeded without incident. The timber was exceptional quality, and we fell into our usual rhythm of cutting, skidding, and loading logs onto the trucks that came twice weekly to haul our harvest to the mills. The work was hard but satisfying, and the pristine wilderness around our operation was beautiful in a way that made even veteran loggers pause occasionally to appreciate the scenery. The equipment performed flawlessly in the cool, moist conditions typical of Pacific Northwest forests. Our feller bunchers could drop the largest trees with precision, their computer-controlled cutting heads making clean cuts that minimized waste. The skidder could drag multiple logs at once from the cutting area to our staging ground, where the loader arranged them for pickup by the transport trucks. It was during our second week that we started noticing unusual signs in the forest around our work site. Trees that we had marked for cutting were found with deep gouges in their bark, scratches that ran from about 7 feet off the ground up to nearly 10 feet high. The marks were too regular to be natural damage, too deep to be made by any known wildlife, and occurred in parallel sets of 4 or 5 lines that suggested massive claws. The scratches appeared overnight on trees throughout our work area, sometimes on specimens we'd planned to cut the following day. The marks were fresh, with sap still weeping from the wounds in the bark, indicating they'd been made recently. More puzzling was their placement, always at heights that would require a creature of enormous size to create, and often on trees that showed no other signs of animal activity. Our equipment operator discovered the first clear evidence that something large was active in the area. While performing his morning inspection routine, he found enormous footprints in the soft earth around his feller buncher. The prints were human-like but much larger, measuring nearly 18 inches long and 8 inches wide at the heel. They showed clear impressions of 5 toes and what appeared to be an arch, but the size was far beyond anything that could belong to a human being. The prints formed a rough circle around the parked machine, as if something had been walking around the equipment during the night, studying it. The creature had approached from the forest and made several complete circuits of the feller buncher before returning to the tree line. The depth of the impressions suggested enormous weight, much more than even the largest human could account for. More disturbing were the handprints we found on the cab windows. Massive palm impressions that could only have been made by something reaching up from ground level to press against the glass nearly 8 feet above the ground. The prints were clearly defined, showing the outline of fingers and palm creases that looked disturbingly human despite their impossible size. Most of the crew initially dismissed these findings as bear sign, though even our most experienced woodsmen had to admit the prints didn't match any bear tracks they'd ever seen. Bears have distinctive claw marks extending well beyond their toe pads, and their rear feet show a characteristic shape that was completely absent from these impressions. These look disturbingly human, just impossibly large. The skeptics pointed out that the Olympic Peninsula was home to some of the largest black bears in North America, and that an unusually large specimen might leave tracks that could be mistaken for something more exotic. But the more we examined the prints, the less they resembled any known animal. The toe placement, the arch structure, and especially the handprints suggested something that walked upright and manipulated objects with human-like dexterity. Our youngest crew member, who'd grown up hunting in these forests with his grandfather, was the first to suggest that we might be dealing with something more unusual than bears or elk. He'd heard stories from Kano and Macaw elders about large, hairy creatures that lived in the deepest parts of the old-growth forests, beings that were almost human but possessed strength and size far beyond any ordinary person. The Native American stories described creatures that were intelligent and generally peaceful, but fiercely protective of their territory. They were said to watch human activities from a distance and would drive away intruders who stayed too long in their domain. Most of us laughed off these suggestions, but privately, many of us were beginning to feel genuinely uneasy about our situation. The sounds started during our third week. At first, they were barely noticeable. Distant crashes in the forest that we attributed to falling dead wood or perhaps other logging operations somewhere beyond our assigned area. But as the days passed, the sounds became more frequent and seemed to be getting closer to our work site. The crashes weren't random windfall. They occurred with a rhythm and pattern that suggested deliberate action. Trees would fall in sequences, creating corridors through the forest that seemed to serve some purpose we couldn't understand. When we investigated some of the nearer crashes, we found healthy trees that had been pushed over rather than cut or broken by wind, their root systems torn from the earth by tremendous applied force. Most unsettling were the vocalizations we began hearing in the early morning hours before dawn. Deep, resonant calls that echoed through the forest like nothing any of us had ever encountered. They weren't quite animal sounds, but they certainly weren't human either. The calls had a deliberate quality to them, rising and falling in patterns that suggested communication rather than random noise. The vocalization seemed to come from multiple sources, creating conversations between unseen beings scattered throughout the forest around our camp. One call would echo from the ridge above us, answered by another from the valley below, then responded to by a third from somewhere deep in the old-growth groves. The exchanges could continue for hours, always just before dawn when the forest was at its quietest. Our equipment operator started keeping a log of the vocalizations, noting their timing, duration, and apparent location. Over the course of several days, a pattern emerged. The calls were most frequent on nights when we'd made significant progress cutting trees, as if our activities were being monitored and discussed by whatever was producing the sounds. The acoustic properties of the calls were unlike anything any of us had heard from known wildlife. They had a depth and resonance that suggested vocal cords much larger than any animal in the Pacific Northwest. The calls carried for miles through the forest, indicating lung capacity and vocal power far beyond human capabilities, but with inflections and modulations that seemed almost linguistic. By the end of our third week, the entire crew was on edge. The combination of strange tracks, mysterious tree damage, and those haunting pre-dawn calls had created an atmosphere of tension that affected our work. Men were constantly glancing toward the forest, jumping at unexpected sounds, and working in closer groups than usual. The first direct encounter happened during our fourth week. Our skidder operator was working alone in a section of forest about a quarter mile from the main crew when he noticed that the normal sounds of the forest had suddenly stopped. The birds, insects, and small mammals that usually provided a constant background of noise had all gone silent, creating an eerie stillness that made him shut down his machine to listen. In the sudden quiet, he heard the sound of something large moving through the thick underbrush nearby. At first, he thought it might be one of the other crew members coming to check on his progress, but the movement was too heavy, too deliberate for a person. Whatever was out there was walking upright, breaking through brush that would stop a man, and doing so with a purpose that suggested intelligence. The skidder operator restarted his machine and began backing toward the main work area, but the sounds of movement kept pace with him, staying just out of sight but clearly following his progress. The creature, whatever it was, seemed to understand the machine's movement patterns and anticipated his direction changes, staying in his blind spots while maintaining a steady presence alongside his retreat. When he reached the staging area where the rest of the crew was working, he told us about his experience. The foreman decided to investigate, and 3 of us followed the skidder tracks back to where the incident had occurred. What we found there changed everything. The underbrush had been trampled in a path that followed the skidder's route for several hundred yards. The depression in the vegetation was too wide for a human, showing the passage of something with a much broader body. The path wasn't random destruction, but seemed calculated to allow quick movement while remaining hidden from view. More importantly, we found several clear footprints in patches of soft ground, all showing the same impossibly large, human-like characteristics we'd seen around our equipment. These prints were deeper and more clearly defined, showing details that left no doubt about what we were dealing with. The toe impressions showed nail marks, the heel showed the characteristic human arch, and the overall size was consistent with a bipedal creature standing at least 8 feet tall. But the most disturbing discovery was evidence of deliberate behavior. Saplings along the path had been broken and twisted into shapes that served no natural purpose, but clearly demonstrated immense strength. Several young trees had been uprooted entirely and thrown aside, creating a cleared corridor through the forest that would allow something large to move more easily through the dense growth. The broken trees weren't random vandalism. They'd been manipulated with precision, bent at specific angles and heights that suggested the creature understood how to modify its environment for easier travel. Some saplings had been woven together to create partial screens that would conceal movement while still allowing observation of the areas beyond. That evening, the foreman made the decision to arm ourselves. He retrieved a 12-gauge shotgun from his pickup truck and distributed several hunting rifles that some of the crew kept for weekend hunting trips. We weren't sure what we were preparing to defend ourselves against, but it was clear that something large, strong, and intelligent was taking an active interest in our operation. The weapons provided psychological comfort more than practical protection. If we were dealing with something strong enough to uproot mature trees and intelligent enough to modify its environment, conventional firearms would likely be inadequate for anything more than deterrence. But having the rifles made us feel less helpless in the face of an unknown threat. We also modified our work schedule to avoid leaving anyone alone in the forest. The buddy system became mandatory, with at least 2 men working together in any remote area. The equipment operators were instructed to maintain radio contact every 30 minutes, and all work stopped an hour before sunset to ensure everyone was back at base camp before darkness fell. The attacks on our equipment began the following night. We'd established a watch rotation with 2 men staying awake to guard the camp and work site during the hours of darkness. The first incident occurred around 3 a.m. when the guards heard the sound of metal being struck repeatedly somewhere near the equipment staging area. When they investigated with powerful flashlights, they found that our backup generator had been attacked. The metal housing was dented and torn as if something had grabbed it and tried to rip it apart with its bare hands. Fuel lines had been yanked loose, and hydraulic fluid was pooled on the ground around the damaged unit. Most unsettling were the handprints left in the soft metal, impressions that showed fingers much longer and thicker than any human hand. The generator attack seemed experimental rather than deliberately destructive. Components had been removed and examined rather than simply destroyed, then placed in neat piles nearby as if they'd been studied and cataloged. The creature had figured out how to open access panels and remove specific parts, demonstrating mechanical understanding that was deeply unsettling. The attacks escalated over the next several nights. Each morning brought new evidence of destruction, equipment damaged, fuel tanks punctured, and tool storage containers torn open and ransacked. Whatever was doing this had incredible strength and seemed particularly interested in our machinery, as if trying to understand how it worked, or perhaps attempting to disable our operation. The pattern of damage suggested systematic investigation rather than random vandalism. Hydraulic systems were dismantled component by component. Electrical systems were traced from power sources to endpoints, and mechanical linkages were operated repeatedly as if being tested. The creature was learning about our equipment through hands-on examination. On the 4th night of attacks, we discovered that our tormentor had figured out how to operate some of our simpler tools. A chainsaw had been started and run until it ran out of fuel, leaving a distinctive cutting pattern on a nearby log pile that showed the creature had experimented with the saw's operation. Hand tools had been used to dismantle parts of our maintenance shed, with bolts and screws removed using the appropriate wrenches and drivers. The intelligence displayed was far beyond anything we'd expected from a wild animal. The creature understood cause and effect, could operate mechanical devices, and was systematically studying our technology. More disturbing was the evidence that it was sharing this knowledge. Multiple handprint sizes on various pieces of equipment suggested that several individuals were involved in the investigations. On the sixth night of attacks, we finally got our first clear look at what we were dealing with. 2 crew members were on guard duty when they heard the familiar sounds of equipment being tampered with near the maintenance shed. Instead of simply investigating, they decided to split up and approach from 2 directions, hoping to catch whatever was causing the damage. What they saw defied everything they thought they knew about the natural world. A creature that stood nearly 9 feet tall was systematically destroying our spare parts inventory. It was covered in dark brown hair and had the general proportions of a human, but scaled up to impossible size. Its arms hung nearly to its knees, and its shoulders were broader than any man's could be. The creature's body showed muscle definition that was clearly visible even through its thick hair covering. Its legs were proportioned like a human's, but massively built, suggesting incredible strength and endurance. The head was distinctly humanoid but primitive, with a pronounced sagittal crest running along the top of the skull and facial features that looked like an evolutionary step between human and something older. The most shocking aspect was the intelligence it displayed. Rather than randomly destroying equipment, the creature was methodically dismantling our hydraulic systems, removing specific components that would render our machines inoperable. It worked with its hands in a deliberate, purposeful manner that suggested it understood the function of what it was destroying. The creature's manual dexterity was remarkable. Its fingers were much longer than human fingers, but showed the same opposable thumb arrangement that allowed for precise manipulation of objects. It could grip small components delicately or apply tremendous force when needed, working with tools in ways that demonstrated both intelligence and mechanical understanding. When one of the guards accidentally stepped on a branch, creating a sharp crack that echoed through the night air, the creature immediately stopped what it was doing and turned toward the sound. In the beam of the flashlight, they saw a face that was unmistakably humanoid but primitive, with heavy brow ridges, a flat nose, and deep-set eyes that reflected the light like an animal's. The face was expressive in ways that were deeply unsettling. The creature's features showed what appeared to be curiosity, calculation, and a form of intelligence that was recognizably conscious. Its eyes tracked the movement of the flashlight beam and focused on the guards with obvious awareness of their presence and potential threat. For several long seconds, man and creature stared at each other across the equipment yard. Then the thing opened its mouth and produced a sound that was part roar, part scream, and unlike anything either man had ever heard. The vocalization was so loud and powerful that both guards felt it as a physical pressure in their chest, and the sound echoed off the surrounding ridges for what seemed like minutes. The creature didn't attack or flee immediately. Instead, it stood its ground and continued to stare at the men as if assessing the threat they represented. When the second guard appeared from the opposite direction, also carrying a rifle and flashlight, the creature seemed to make a decision. It let out another earth-shaking roar and then turned and walked, not ran, but walked, into the forest with a casual confidence that was more terrifying than any display of aggression could have been. The creature's departure was deliberate and unhurried, as if it was making a point about its fearlessness rather than retreating from a superior force. It paused at the tree line and looked back at the guards one more time before disappearing into the darkness, leaving behind the clear impression that this encounter was ending on its terms, not theirs. The next morning, we found that the creature had returned after the guards reported the encounter to the rest of the crew. Our main Fellerbuncher had been attacked with a ferocity that left all of us stunned. The machine's cab had been ripped open like a tin can, with steel plates that were half an inch thick torn and twisted into impossible shapes. The engine compartment had been systematically destroyed, with crucial components removed and scattered throughout the worksite. The hydraulic lines had been yanked out and tied into knots, a display of both strength and intelligence that left no doubt we were dealing with something far beyond our understanding. The creature had even figured out how to drain the fuel tank, though whether this was intentional or accidental remained unclear. The fuel had been allowed to drain into a natural depression in the ground, suggesting some awareness of environmental impact. More disturbing than the destruction itself was the realization that the creature could have easily killed any of us if that had been its intention. The same strength that had torn apart our heavy machinery could have ripped a human being apart without effort. The fact that it had focused its aggression on our equipment rather than on us suggested a level of restraint and intelligence that made the situation even more frightening. The destroyed Fellerbuncher represented $250,000 in equipment, but that wasn't what concerned us most. The systematic nature of the destruction, the evidence of planning and intelligence, and the creature's obvious understanding of how to disable our operation created a level of psychological pressure that was affecting the entire crew. Several men reported nightmares and insomnia following the incident. The feeling of being studied and evaluated by something that possessed near-human intelligence but superhuman physical capabilities was deeply disturbing. We were no longer dealing with a wild animal that might be driven away or avoided, but with conscious beings who had made a deliberate decision to oppose our presence in their territory. The foreman made the decision to evacuate the site immediately. We'd lost one of our two main pieces of cutting equipment, and it was clear that whatever was out there wasn't going to allow us to continue working in its territory. The company's insurance might cover the equipment damage, but none of us were willing to risk our lives trying to complete a job under these circumstances. But the evacuation process proved more complicated than we had anticipated. When the foreman tried to reach the company's regional office on the satellite phone to report our situation and request immediate pickup of personnel and remaining equipment, he found that the communication device had been disabled. Someone or something had removed crucial components from the satellite transmitter, leaving us unable to contact the outside world. The deliberate sabotage of our communication equipment was perhaps the most frightening development yet. It demonstrated that the creatures understood the function of technology they'd never seen before and could systematically disable our ability to call for help. We were now completely isolated in hostile territory with no way to communicate our situation to anyone outside the forest. Loading our remaining functional equipment and personal belongings took most of the morning. As we worked, we could feel eyes watching us from the forest surrounding the worksite. Occasionally, we'd catch glimpses of movement in the tree line, dark shapes that were too large and moved too purposefully to be bears or any other known wildlife. The watchers weren't trying to hide their presence anymore. We could see them moving between the trees, staying just far enough away to avoid clear identification, but close enough to make their surveillance obvious. The psychological effect was devastating. We felt like animals being studied by predators who were deciding when and how to strike. During the packing process, we discovered additional evidence of the creature's intelligence and organization. Tools that we had left unattended for even a few minutes would be moved or arranged in different patterns as if something was examining them while we weren't looking. The arrangements weren't random, but seemed to follow some kind of logic that we couldn't understand. More disturbing was evidence that the creatures had been in our living quarters during the night. Personal belongings had been moved and examined, though nothing had been stolen or destroyed. Clothing had been unfolded and refolded, Photographs had been removed from wallets and studied, then carefully replaced, and books had been opened to specific pages as if the contents were being reviewed. The feeling of being observed was so intense that several crew members developed severe headaches from the psychological pressure. The constant awareness that intelligent beings were watching our every move, evaluating our behavior, and possibly planning some action against us created a level of stress that was physically debilitating. Our convoy of trucks and the remaining equipment left the site around noon, beginning the long, winding journey down the mountain road towards civilization. None of us spoke much during the drive, all of us processing what we'd experienced over the past 6 weeks. The silence was broken only by the occasional comment about a strange sound from the forest or a dark shape glimpsed moving between the trees alongside the road. The forest seemed to be alive with activity as we drove out. Movement in the trees paralleled our progress, and the feeling of being escorted rather than simply leaving was unmistakable. Whatever we'd encountered wasn't content to simply see us gone. They were making sure we left and didn't return. About 10 miles from the worksite, we encountered evidence that our creature wasn't unique in these forests. A massive tree had fallen across the road, blocking our progress completely. The tree was healthy and showed no signs of storm damage or disease that might explain its fall. More importantly, the trunk had been broken rather than cut, snapped off about 8 feet from the base by what could only have been enormous applied force. The fallen tree was a Douglas fir with a trunk diameter of nearly 4 feet, representing hundreds of years of growth and weighing several tons. Breaking such a tree would require force measured in tens of thousands of pounds, far beyond the capability of any known animal. Yet the break showed no tool marks or evidence of machinery, only the splintered wood pattern that results from overwhelming physical stress. While we were examining the fallen tree and discussing how to move it, we heard the calls beginning in the forest around us. The same deep, resonant vocalizations we'd heard at the worksite, but now coming from multiple directions. We were surrounded by several of these creatures, and they were communicating with each other in a way that suggested coordination and intelligence. The calls formed a complex pattern of communication that seemed almost linguistic. Different tones and durations conveyed specific meanings, and the responses came in sequences that resembled conversation more than animal communication. We were listening to a discussion about our presence, conducted in a language we couldn't understand but could recognize as deliberate communication between intelligent beings. The foreman made the decision to abandon our remaining equipment and continue on foot. We grabbed our personal belongings and weapons and began hiking down the mountain road, leaving behind trucks and machinery worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Behind us, we could hear the sounds of our abandoned vehicles being explored and possibly destroyed, but none of us had any intention of going back to investigate. The decision to abandon our equipment was made easier by the realization that the creatures had probably been planning this roadblock all along. The precision with which the tree had been felled to completely block the narrow mountain road, combined with the coordinated calls from the surrounding forest, suggested a level of planning and cooperation that was both impressive and terrifying. The hike to the nearest town took 18 hours, during which we were constantly aware of being followed. The creatures stayed in the forest alongside the road, keeping pace with our group, but never showing themselves clearly. Occasionally, we'd hear their calls echoing between the ridges, messages being passed from one to another in what seemed like a primitive but effective communication system. The escort wasn't threatening in any obvious way, but the psychological pressure was intense. We were being shepherded out of the territory by beings who could have easily killed us if they'd chosen to do so. The restraint they showed was perhaps more frightening than aggression would have been, as it demonstrated a level of intelligence and decision-making capability that was disturbingly human-like. During the long hike, we had time to discuss what we had experienced and try to make sense of the encounters. The creatures had shown intelligence, organization, and technological curiosity that exceeded anything we'd expected from wildlife. They'd systematically studied our equipment, learned to operate some of our tools, and coordinated their activities in ways that suggested complex social structure. Most disturbing was the realization that they'd been studying us as much as our equipment. The evidence of their presence in our living quarters, the careful examination of personal belongings, and the obvious surveillance of our daily activities suggested that we'd been the subjects of an investigation by beings who were trying to understand human behavior and capabilities. When we finally reached civilization and contacted our company's regional office, our account of what had happened was met with skepticism and suspicion. Equipment worth nearly $1 million had been abandoned in the forest, and our explanation of attacks by unknown creatures was dismissed as either a cover-up for negligence or evidence of some kind of group psychological breakdown. Company investigators were dispatched to the site within 48 hours, but they found no trace of our abandoned equipment. Everything had vanished: trucks, machinery, tools, and supplies, as if it had never existed. The investigators' report concluded that we had fabricated our story to cover up the theft and sale of company property, and legal action was threatened against the entire crew. The missing equipment represented the most puzzling aspect of the entire incident. Heavy machinery weighing tens of thousands of pounds had simply disappeared from a location accessible only by a single mountain road. The investigators found no tire tracks, drag marks, or other evidence that the equipment had been removed by conventional means. The situation was resolved only when satellite reconnaissance images became available, showing massive disturbances in the forest around our work site. The images revealed that an area covering several square miles had been systematically altered, with new paths carved through the forest and what appeared to be primitive structures built in several locations. The scale of the changes could not have been accomplished by human beings using conventional methods. More importantly, the satellite images showed large shapes moving through the forest, bipedal figures that were clearly visible against the forest floor but were far too large to be human. The images provided undeniable proof that something unusual was active in that area, though the company classified the information and refused to make it public. The satellite data also revealed the fate of our abandoned equipment. The machinery had been systematically dismantled and the components scattered throughout the forest in patterns that suggested deliberate distribution rather than random destruction. Parts of our trucks and equipment were found miles from the original location, apparently carried there by beings with enormous strength. Each member of our crew was required to sign comprehensive non-disclosure agreements in exchange for compensation for our lost equipment and the traumatic nature of our experience. We were warned that any public discussion of our encounter would result in severe legal and financial consequences, and that the creatures we'd encountered were part of a classified research project involving endangered species protection. The legal documents we signed were far more comprehensive than typical non-disclosure agreements. They covered not only our experiences with the creatures, but any information about the work site, the satellite data, and the government response to our situation. Violation of the agreement would result in criminal prosecution under federal statutes related to national security. The truth, as we learned through unofficial channels, was that the government had been aware of these creatures for decades. Small populations of what could only be described as relict hominids had been living in the most remote areas of the Pacific Northwest, surviving in territories that were carefully managed to minimize contact with human activities. Our logging operation had inadvertently encroached on one of these protected areas, triggering the defensive response we had experienced. The creatures were not the primitive monsters of legend, but rather intelligent beings with complex social structures and sophisticated survival strategies. They had been living alongside human civilization for thousands of years, avoiding contact through careful selection of habitat and deliberate avoidance of human activities. The few encounters that had occurred over the decades had been systematically suppressed to protect both the creatures and the human populations that might panic if their existence became widely known. The government's knowledge of these beings dated back to early forest surveys in the 1930s, when evidence of their existence first began accumulating through reports from loggers, hunters, and government surveyors. A classified research program had been established to study the creatures and monitor their populations while maintaining absolute secrecy about their existence. Our experience was not unique, but it was one of the most extensive documented encounters with these beings. The fact that we'd maintained a presence in their territory for over a month had allowed researchers to observe behavior and intelligence that had never been recorded before. Our equipment had been systematically studied and then hidden to prevent any evidence from reaching the public. The research data collected from our encounter apparently contributed to a better understanding of the creature's technological capabilities and social organization. The systematic way they'd studied our equipment, learned to operate our tools, and coordinated their response to our presence provided insights into their intelligence and adaptability that had never been documented before. I've spent the past 27 years trying to process what I experienced in those Washington forests. The nightmares have faded, but I still wake up sometimes hearing those impossible vocalizations echoing through my dreams. I've moved far from any large forests and chosen work that keeps me in cities and populated areas. But I've never forgotten the feeling of being watched by something that was both more and less than human. The knowledge that such creatures exist has changed my understanding of the natural world in ways that are difficult to describe. We share this planet with intelligent beings that have chosen to remain hidden, living parallel lives in the few remaining wilderness areas that human development hasn't destroyed. They're not monsters or myths, but fellow inhabitants of Earth who found a way to survive alongside a dominant species that refuses to acknowledge their existence. The psychological impact of the encounter has been lasting and profound. Knowing that beings of such intelligence and capability exist but remain hidden has made me question many assumptions about human knowledge and the natural world. If creatures this remarkable can remain secret, what else might exist that we don't know about or refuse to acknowledge? Recent news reports of construction projects being mysteriously halted in remote areas, of equipment being found destroyed in ways that can't be explained by conventional means, suggests that the pressure of expanding human development is making these encounters more frequent. The creature's traditional territories are being encroached upon by roads, developments, and resource extraction, forcing them into contact with human activities despite their clear preference for isolation. Climate change and deforestation are reducing the wilderness areas where these beings can live undisturbed. As their habitat shrinks and human activities expand into previously remote areas, encounters like ours are becoming inevitable. The government's ability to suppress information about these incidents may be reaching its limits as the frequency and scale of encounters increase. I'm telling this story now because I believe people have a right to know what's sharing the forest with them. The legal agreements I signed may still be binding, but I'm old enough now that the consequences matter less than the truth. Those magnificent, terrifying beings deserve recognition and protection, not as subjects for study or management, but as fellow inhabitants of a world that belongs to all of us. The forest remembers everything, and somewhere in those deep woods of the Pacific Northwest, they're still watching and waiting, hoping that we'll find a way to coexist without destroying the ancient balance that has allowed them to survive for thousands of years. For more interesting stories like this one, consider checking this.